It began with a sealed crimson dispatch box quietly removed from a private chamber at Balmoral, an ordinary movement that, according to palace insiders, triggered extraordinary panic behind royal walls. Queen Camilla was reportedly expecting the late Queen Elizabeth II's final handwritten letters to reinforce her standing inside the monarchy. Instead, whispers suggest the documents had been entrusted to someone else entirely. And within hours, Camilla allegedly took immediate action that stunned even veteran courtiers. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What happened behind the stone walls of Balmoral that morning was initially treated as little more than a routine archival procedure. According to reports circulating among royal correspondents and palace administrative circles, staff assigned to inventory Queen Elizabeth II's remaining personal effects were carrying out one final review of correspondence preserved from the monarch's final years. These were not ordinary letters. They were said to include private reflections, handwritten directives, and deeply personal communications intended only for the most trusted figures within the House of Windsor. And for weeks, insiders whisper that there had been a quiet assumption flowing through Clarence's house that Queen Camilla would naturally be among those entrusted with the late Queen's final sentiments. But the reality unfolding inside Balmoral allegedly told a very different story. Sources familiar with the operation claim several sealed envelopes bore the names of Prince William and Princess Anne. Not Camilla, not her inner circle, not the Parker Bowles faction that had steadily grown in influence since the sun-drenched coronation of 2023. The omission reportedly landed like a shockwave through royal households already strained by King Charles III's declining health and the growing uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's future. Palace insiders claimed the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. One senior aide allegedly described the mood as icy and deeply unsettled, with staff instructed to avoid discussing the discovery even in private offices. Reports suggest emergency consultations were quietly arranged between Clarence House advisors and legal figures connected to royal estate administration. Why the sudden urgency? Why the abrupt tightening of internal communication channels? Those questions only intensified after whispers emerged that Camilla herself had allegedly demanded rapid reviews of staffing access, archive permissions, and document handling procedures across multiple royal residences. To veteran courtiers, the response reportedly felt unusually personal. Various interpretations of the situation suggest Camilla had expected some form of written validation from Queen Elizabeth II, something symbolic, perhaps even historic, that would cement her standing inside the institution after years of public skepticism. Instead, according to royal commentators, the late Queen's silence toward Camilla within these letters may have carried a meaning far louder than words themselves. And then came the detail that truly alarmed palace observers. Throughout the escalating tension, Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly refused to engage publicly or privately with the growing speculation. No denials, no reassurances, no visible attempt to calm the increasingly volatile atmosphere inside royal circles. Sources close to palace staff claim Anne remained characteristically composed while William continued official duties with almost surgical discipline, even as rumors spread that the contents of the letters were already becoming the subject of quiet conversations among the monarchy's old guard. That silence was interpreted by many not as indifference, but as confirmation that something far more consequential was unfolding beneath the surface. Because within the sacred geography of the British monarchy, silence has always been one of the crown's most devastating weapons. And as the days passed, it became increasingly clear that the real crisis was no longer about inheritance, protocol, or even personal loyalty. Something much larger appeared to be emerging from the shadows of Balmoral itself. But the real shock was not simply who received the Queen's letters, it was what those letters were rumored to contain about the future of the monarchy itself. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly understood that the greatest threats to the monarchy rarely arrived from Parliament or protesters. They emerged quietly from inside the family itself. And according to royal historians, her final written directives may have been designed as one last safeguard against internal instability after her death. Long before the current turmoil surrounding Queen Camilla and the mysterious letters discovered at Balmoral, the late Queen had already earned a near-mythical reputation inside palace walls for documenting everything. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary discipline. Palace insiders have long claimed that Elizabeth II believed memory alone could never protect the crown. Records did. Handwritten directives did. Carefully preserved correspondence did. And over the course of her 70-year reign, reports suggest she developed a deeply private system of preserving thoughts, warnings, and institutional guidance that only a select inner circle ever fully understood. At the center of that world stood the famous red boxes, those locked dispatch cases that followed the sovereign across palaces, estates, and Commonwealth tours for decades. To the public, they symbolized royal duty. But according to commentators like Robert Hardman and Ingrid Seward, the boxes allegedly carried far more than state papers. Insiders whisper they also became repositories of confidential reflections, memoranda, and personal assessments tied to the monarch. High's long-term survival. Elizabeth reportedly understood that every generation of Windsor royalty faced the same dangerous temptation, confusing personal desire with institutional responsibility. And according to various interpretations from palace administrative circles, she spent her final years preparing for precisely the kind of internal struggle now emerging behind closed doors. That preparation allegedly intensified after the final years of Prince Philip's life, when concerns surrounding succession, influence, and loyalty reportedly became more pronounced within the firm. Sources familiar with royal operations suggest the Queen quietly began mapping future alliances well before her death, carefully identifying which members of the family she believed could preserve continuity during an unstable transition period. And among those repeatedly trusted with increasing responsibility was Princess Anne. For decades, Anne had operated as the monarchy's iron-willed enforcer, rarely emotional, rarely distracted, and almost obsessively committed to duty over popularity. Reports suggest Elizabeth viewed her daughter not simply as dependable, but as one of the last remaining royals capable of separating personal relationships from institutional survival. That trust allegedly extended into confidential oversight matters tied to estates, archival procedures, and continuity planning during the succession era. Palace insiders claim Anne's influence behind the scenes became especially critical after Charles ascended the throne and the balance of power inside royal households began subtly shifting. At the same time, Prince William was increasingly viewed by traditionalists as the monarchy's future stabilizer. According to those familiar with duchy operations and succession planning, William represented continuity in its purest form, disciplined, cautious, and deeply aware of the damage public instability could inflict upon the sacred geography of the British monarchy. That perception reportedly placed him in quiet alignment with Anne long before the Balmoral letters were ever discovered. And then there was Camilla. While publicly accepted after years of controversy, reports suggest her growing influence following the coronation caused lingering discomfort among sections of the monarchy's old guard. Not necessarily because of personal hostility, but because traditionalists allegedly feared the emergence of competing loyalties inside the institution itself. The concern, according to royal observers, was never simply about image. It was about legacy, about who ultimately shaped the monarchy after Charles, about whether the crown would remain anchored to duty or gradually drift toward personal alliances and private influence networks. That is why the discovery of the letters reportedly caused such profound unease. Because if Queen Elizabeth had indeed spent years documenting her final institutional concerns, then every omission inside those papers carried meaning. Every name mattered. Every instruction mattered even more. And according to whispers from inside palace administrative circles, one particular sentence inside those letters may have changed everything overnight. The response was said to be immediate, surgical, and deeply revealing. Within 48 hours of the discovery, reports suggest Queen Camilla launched what aides privately described as a domestic counteroffensive across multiple royal households. The timing, insiders claim, was far too precise to be coincidence. By then, the atmosphere surrounding the monarchy had already shifted into something darker and far more unstable than the public realized. The whispers surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's letters were no longer confined to quiet conversations among archivists and senior aides. They had begun spreading through the invisible corridors of palace influence, where reputations are protected, alliances are tested, and loyalty becomes a form of currency. According to sources familiar with Clarence House operations, Camilla allegedly understood immediately that the letters posed more than a symbolic problem. If the late Queen had truly entrusted her most sensitive reflections to Prince William and Princess Anne, while excluding Camilla entirely, then the issue was no longer personal embarrassment. It was institutional vulnerability. Reports suggest the first signs of the counteroffensive emerged through a rapid internal reshuffling among aides long associated with Camilla's household network. Several staff members were allegedly reassigned or quietly removed from sensitive administrative positions connected to communications and archival access. Palace commentators described the pace as unusually aggressive, especially during a period when King Charles was already navigating health concerns and mounting public pressure. One insider reportedly claimed the atmosphere felt less like ordinary palace management and more like bureaucratic warfare behind velvet curtains. At the same time, scrutiny surrounding confidential records reportedly intensified across multiple royal residences. Access permissions were allegedly reviewed. Internal communication channels became heavily restricted. According to whispers from palace administrative streams, even long-serving staff found themselves subjected to renewed oversight regarding who could handle sensitive material connected to the late Queen's correspondence. Why such urgency? Why the sudden fear surrounding documents that, officially at least, did not even publicly exist? Those questions only deepened after reports surfaced of emergency consultations involving figures connected to Tom Parker Bowles' wider social and advisory circle. While no official confirmation ever emerged, royal observers quickly noticed a hardening of internal divisions. The strain between Camilla's faction and allies associated with Princess Anne reportedly became increasingly visible behind closed doors. Familiar with royal household dynamics, Anne remained outwardly silent but privately immovable, refusing to engage with what some insiders allegedly viewed as attempts to contain or reinterpret the significance of the letters. That silence again proved devastating, because within the House of Windsor, silence is often interpreted as confidence, and confidence usually means preparation. Meanwhile, King Charles reportedly found himself trapped in an impossible position. Sources close to palace operations suggest the king was deeply aware that any perception of instability inside the monarchy could trigger long-term reputational damage during an already fragile period of transition. But balancing loyalty to his wife against the institutional authority still surrounding his mother's legacy may have become one of the most painful private struggles of his reign. Observers claim Charles appeared increasingly isolated as tensions escalated between competing power centers operating beneath the surface of royal life. And yet the deeper the situation unfolded, the more one unsettling possibility continued haunting palace insiders. What if Anne had anticipated all of this long before the Balmoral discovery ever occurred? What if the Princess Royal already understood exactly what the Queen's letters contained and had quietly prepared for the fallout in advance? That question reportedly began spreading through royal circles with alarming speed, because if true, it meant the balance of power inside the monarchy had shifted long before anyone realized the battle had even begun. But Camilla's greatest concern may not have been the letters themselves, it was the possibility that Anne already knew what was inside them long before anyone else did. If Camilla represented modern palace maneuvering, Princess Anne represented something far older and far more feared. The moment reports of the Queen's letters surfaced, insiders claimed the Princess Royal quietly activated the machinery of what veteran courtiers call the Old Guard. Unlike other senior royals who relied on public approval, carefully managed interviews, or strategic appearances to maintain influence, Anne allegedly operated through discipline, procedure, and institutional memory. For decades, she had built a reputation inside palace walls as the one royal who neither sought attention nor tolerated instability. And according to regarding longtime observers of royal operations, that reputation became critically important the moment the Balmoral letters threatened to fracture the monarchy from within. While panic reportedly spread through competing households and speculation intensified across elite media circles, Anne's response was said to be calm, deliberate, and almost chillingly efficient. Sources familiar with palace administration claim the Princess Royal immediately began coordinating with long-serving legal advisors connected to royal estate oversight, archival protections, and succession-era continuity planning. These were not political strategists or public relations figures. They were institutional guardians, individuals who had spent decades protecting the operational machinery of the crown itself. Reports suggest confidential consultations quietly took place involving sensitive protocols tied to estate documentation, restricted archives, and legacy directives believed to date back to Queen Elizabeth II's final years. The atmosphere, insiders claim, shifted from confusion to containment. It was during this period that whispers surrounding something called the Windsor Continuity Doctrine alleged DLY began circulating through royal administrative circles. While no official acknowledgement of such a doctrine exists publicly, various interpretations suggest it referred to a private institutional understanding developed during the late Queen's reign, one centered on preserving the monarchy's stability above personal loyalties or emotional considerations. According to commentators familiar with palace tradition, the principle was brutally simple. The crown survives only when duty overrides attachment, and if reports are accurate, Anne had become its most uncompromising enforcer. Prince William reportedly aligned himself closely with that philosophy as tensions escalated. Sources suggest the Prince of Wales viewed the growing unrest surrounding the letters not merely as a family dispute, but as a direct threat to institutional continuity during one of the monarchy's most vulnerable transitions in modern history. That alignment between William and Anne allegedly formed a powerful internal bloc rooted not in ambition, but in preservation. Together, according to palace whispers, they represented the old guard's answer to uncertainty, a silent counterweight against what some traditionalist feared was the increasing personalization of royal power. At the same time, reports indicate heightened reviews were conducted across multiple royal estates and archival systems under extraordinary secrecy. Access permissions were allegedly tightened. Certain internal privileges connected to correspondence handling and administrative oversight were quietly re-evaluated. While no formal announcements were ever made, insiders claim the changes were unmistakable to those operating within royal households. The message, according to one palace source, was devastatingly clear. Influence alone could not override structure. And nowhere was that realization reportedly felt more sharply than within Camilla's circle itself. For years, her growing position beside Charles had steadily expanded her influence across palace operations and social networks connected to the monarchy. But according to royal commentators, the emergence of Anne's institutional counterweight exposed the limits of personal proximity to the throne. Because while Camilla may have possessed access, Anne possessed legitimacy forged through decades of unwavering service to the crown. That distinction suddenly mattered to me, more than ever. The deeper the crisis unfolded, the more the monarchy appeared divided between two competing visions of royal power, one shaped through personal influence and modern alliances, the other rooted in continuity, hierarchy, and the uncompromising discipline Queen Elizabeth II allegedly spent her life protecting. And caught directly between those forces was a king already weakened by illness, exhaustion, and the unbearable pressure of holding the institution together, while the people closest to him quietly drifted into conflict. And as tensions deepened inside royal residences, King Charles reportedly found himself facing an impossible choice between peace at home and loyalty to his mother's final wishes. Observers say King Charles appeared increasingly exhausted in the weeks that followed, not merely by illness, but by the growing fracture spreading through the House of Windsor itself. What began as private correspondence had allegedly evolved into a silent battle over legacy, authority, and the monarchy's future direction. For much of his life, Charles had waited for the crown with almost painful patience. He had endured decades as heir apparent, survived public humiliation, navigated family scandals, and finally ascended the throne during one of the most emotionally fragile periods in modern royal history. But according to palace insiders, nothing prepared him for the quiet war now unfolding inside the institution he had spent his entire life trying to protect. Because this was no longer about public image. It was no longer about newspaper headlines or temporary controversy. The conflict surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's final letters allegedly struck at the very heart of royal legitimacy itself. Reports suggest Charles spent those weeks attempting to mediate between Queen Camilla and Princess Anne behind closed doors, hoping to contain tensions before they hardened into something irreversible. Sources familiar with palace dynamics claim the king repeatedly sought compromise, urging restraint from both factions while privately struggling to preserve a sense of unity within the family. But the deeper the crisis evolved, the more impossible that task reportedly became. Anne remained firmly aligned with what insiders described as the monarchy's institutional safeguards, while Camilla's allies allegedly demanded reassurance that her standing inside The crown would not quietly erode in the shadow of Elizabeth's final wishes. To the public, Charles continued carrying out engagements with measured calm, projecting the familiar discipline expected of a sovereign. Yet royal commentators increasingly noted the contrast between those appearances and the instability reportedly growing behind palace walls. Observers described a monarch visibly worn down not simply physically, but emotionally. Because according to whispers from administrative circles, Charles feared something larger than family disagreement. He feared another institutional crisis, another period where the monarchy itself became consumed by internal division at the precise moment it could least afford weakness. That fear reportedly intensified as Prince William became more vocal in defending what insiders described as Queen Elizabeth's sacred trust vision for the future of the monarchy. Sources suggest William viewed the situation through the lens of continuity rather than emotion, believing the institution could only survive if the crown remained anchored to discipline and long-standing constitutional principles. While careful never to publicly challenge his father, Camilla, reports indicate William's alignment with Anne further deepened the sense of separation quietly forming inside the royal structure. Meanwhile, Camilla's supporters allegedly grew increasingly anxious about what the letters symbolized. Even without public confirmation of their contents, the growing perception that Elizabeth II had placed her deepest confidence in Anne and William rather than Camilla reportedly created a dangerous imbalance inside palace politics. According to various interpretations from royal insiders, the issue was no longer whether Camilla remained queen beside Charles. It was whether the monarchy's future power centers truly accepted her place within its long-term legacy. That uncertainty reportedly fueled private frustration, defensive maneuvering, and growing suspicion toward the old guard surrounding Anne. Royal commentators soon began describing the atmosphere as a cold civil war, unfolding within palace structures, a conflict fought not through public confrontation, but through silence, procedure, access, and influence. There were no dramatic declarations, no open accusations, only carefully measured moves, quiet resistance, and the constant feature that one wrong step could fracture the monarchy during one of its most vulnerable transitions in generations. And standing directly at the center of that pressure was Charles himself, increasingly isolated between loyalty to his wife, devotion to his late mother's legacy, and the unbearable responsibility of holding the crown together while the people closest to him quietly drifted apart. But the final turning point came when details from the Queen's letters allegedly began circulating beyond palace walls, and the symbolism was devastating. Then came the leak. Not an official statement, not a palace announcement, just a quiet whisper that escaped into elite media circles before detonating across royal commentary networks like a controlled explosion. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether Queen Elizabeth left letters behind, but why Camilla had reportedly been excluded from their inner circle of trust. At first, the information surfaced in fragments. A discreet mention during private aristocratic gatherings, a carefully worded hint passed between royal correspondents. Then came the subtle shifts in tone from commentators long connected to palace circles. According to reports, journalists associated with publications like Tatler and the Times began hearing whispers that selective personal correspondence from Queen Elizabeth II had indeed been discovered during confidential Balmoral archival reviews. But what truly stunned insiders was the growing suggestion that the late Queen's most personal reflections had allegedly bypassed Camilla entirely while strengthening the institutional authority of Princess Anne and Prince William. The symbolism was devastating. Inside Britain's aristocratic networks, omission often carries more power than open criticism, and according to Palace Watch commentators, Camilla's reported absence from the Queen's final circle of written trust quickly became interpreted as something far more serious than a personal slight. It was increasingly framed as a form of symbolic financial and emotional excommunication from the deepest institutional core of the monarchy itself. No official accusation had been made. No condemnation had been spoken publicly. Yet the silence surrounding the letters somehow carried a sharper edge than direct confrontation ever could. As speculation intensified, reports suggest public sympathy quietly began shifting toward Anne and William. For years, both had cultivated reputations centered around discipline, continuity, and restraint. Now, according to royal observers, those qualities suddenly appeared deeply significant within the context of the unfolding crisis. Anne's silence was interpreted as strength, William's careful distance from public drama was viewed as maturity, and together, they increasingly came to represent what many traditionalists believed Queen Elizabeth had spent her life trying to preserve: a monarchy governed by duty rather than personality. Meanwhile, Camilla reportedly found herself trapped in an increasingly defensive position. Sources close to royal commentary circles claim every attempt to contain the speculation only intensified the perception of instability behind palace walls. Clarence House reportedly avoided direct engagement with the rumors, yet insiders suggest the lack of denial created even greater intrigue among commentators and social elites alike. Questions multiplied rapidly. Why had the Queen allegedly entrusted certain figures with private directives while excluding others? What had she anticipated during her final years? And perhaps most arousingly of all, what exactly did those letters say? Royal commentators soon began describing the monarchy as entering one of its most politically fragile transitional chapters since the aftermath of Princess Diana's death. According to various interpretations circulating through elite media circles, the issue had evolved beyond ordinary family tension. It now touched the sacred mythology surrounding Queen Elizabeth II herself. Because if the late monarch had truly spent years preparing for institutional instability after her death, then every emerging detail from the letters carried the weight of prophecy. And prophecies inside royal institutions have a dangerous tendency to reshape power long before facts are ever confirmed. Behind closed doors, reports suggest anxiety spread rapidly across multiple royal households as aristocratic networks, political observers, and palace insiders quietly dissected every new whisper. Some feared the leak would permanently damage Camilla's standing within sections of the establishment. Others worried it exposed a deeper fracture inside the monarchy itself, one that could weaken Charles during an already vulnerable reign. But perhaps the most unsettling, telling consequence of all was the growing realization that Queen Elizabeth's influence had not diminished after death. According to insiders, it had become even more powerful precisely because she was no longer alive to clarify, soften, or reinterpret her intentions. And as the speculation spread further beyond palace control, one haunting reality continued hanging over the monarchy like a shadow it could no longer escape, because behind all the rumors, alliances, and institutional maneuvering remained a far more chilling possibility that the Queen's final letters were never intended to comfort the family at all, but to warn them about what was coming next. Yet behind all the speculation, one haunting question remained unanswered. What final warning had Queen Elizabeth actually tried to leave behind? Those familiar with royal history often say Queen Elizabeth II understood something few modern figures ever truly grasped. Institutions do not collapse all at once, they erode slowly, through compromise, entitlement, and silence. And according to palace whispers, her final letters may have carried precisely that warning. For more than 70 years, Elizabeth II reportedly approached monarchy not as personal property but as a sacred obligation temporarily placed in human hands. That distinction defined her reign. It shaped the discipline she demanded from herself, the emotional restraint she expected from others, and the unwavering belief that the crown could only survive when duty stood above individual ambition. According to historians and former palace insiders, the late Queen spent decades watching members of her own family struggle against that reality. Some adapted to it, others resisted it. But Elizabeth allegedly never lost sight of one uncomfortable truth. The monarchy survives only when the institution remains greater than the people serving inside it. That is why the growing fascination surrounding her final letters became so emotionally explosive, because reports suggest the documents were never simply personal messages meant to comfort grieving relatives after her death. According to whispers circulating through royal administrative circles, the language inside them allegedly focused repeatedly on themes like continuity, service, and preservation of constitutional discipline during uncertain times. To some observers, those words sounded less similar to sentimental reflections and more like final instructions from a monarch who understood the storms gathering around her family long before the public ever noticed them. And in that context, the rising prominence of Princess Anne and Prince William suddenly appeared deeply significant. Palace commentators increasingly framed both figures not merely as trusted relatives, but as guardians of institutional stability chosen to protect what Elizabeth reportedly viewed as the monarchy's sacred center. Anne represented relentless duty without ego. William symbolized controlled modernity anchored to tradition. Together, according to various interpretations, they embodied the exact balance the Queen may have hoped would guide the crown through an unstable transition era. That perception only intensified speculation surrounding Camilla's reported exclusion from the Queen's most personal directives. Royal historians were quick to note that within the House of Windsor, omission often carries symbolic weight far beyond personal emotion. According to commentators familiar with past succession crises, royal correspondence has historically been used not simply to express affection, but to establish legitimacy, continuity, and institutional confidence during periods of uncertainty. And if reports are accurate, Camilla's absence from those final written trusts may have reflected something profoundly structural rather than merely personal. Some historians even began quietly comparing the situation to earlier moments of tension within royal history, when questions surrounding influence, succession, and loyalty threatened to destabilize the monarchy from within. Because while eras change, the core struggle remains hauntingly familiar. Who truly serves the crown, and who ultimately seeks to shape it for themselves? According to palace observers, that question now sits at the center of the entire crisis unfolding behind royal walls. At the same time, another idea began taking hold within public imagination, an almost eerie sense that Queen Elizabeth II was still shaping the monarchy even after death. Commentators described her influence as extending from beyond the grave, not through dramatic revelations, but through carefully preserved words carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne. The effect was emotionally overwhelming for many traditionalists. Because in the silence surrounding the letters, they saw the return of the late Queen's most enduring lesson, that the sacred geography of the British monarchy was never meant to revolve around personalities, emotions, or temporary alliances. It was meant to survive them all. And perhaps that is what made the unfolding conflict feel so much larger than an ordinary family dispute. This was no longer simply about who had access to private letters or who held influence beside the king. It had become a struggle over meaning itself, over whether Queen Elizabeth's final vision for the monarchy would endure or quietly disappear beneath the pressures of modern royal life. And in the end, the struggle over those letters became about far more than inheritance. It became a battle over who truly represented the crown's future. By the time the palace quieted, the damage had already been done. Relationships had reportedly hardened, alliances had shifted, and the late Queen's silent influence seemed stronger in death than many living royals could command in life. What remained was a monarchy forced once again to decide whether it would protect comfort or protect continuity. In the weeks that followed the the House of Windsor reportedly entered a colder, more disciplined phase of existence. The panic that once rippled through royal households gradually faded into something far more dangerous: acceptance. According to palace insiders, everyone inside the institution understood that the balance of power had subtly changed, even if no public acknowledgement would ever be made. Queen Elizabeth II's final letters had become more than private correspondence. They had evolved into symbols, silent reminders of who the late monarch allegedly trusted to defend the crown when uncertainty closed in around it. And in the eyes of many traditionalists, that trust now appeared firmly anchored in Princess Anne and Prince William. Observers increasingly described the pair as the monarchy's symbolic guardians, not because they sought power openly, but because they represented continuity at a moment when continuity felt fragile. Anne remained the iron figure at the center of the old guard, carrying herself with the same relentless discipline that had defined her entire life. William, meanwhile, appeared to emerge from the crisis with greater institutional weight than ever before. Reports suggest major figures across palace operations began quietly viewing him not merely as the future king, but as the stabilizing force capable of carrying Elizabeth's constitutional vision into a deeply uncertain era. Together, they came to embody the very principle the late Queen allegedly valued above all else: duty before self. For Camilla, however, the aftermath reportedly carried a far more painful reality. Publicly, her position beside King Charles remained unchanged. She was still queen, still present beside the sovereign during official engagements, still protected by the formal structure of the crown. But according to royal commentators, influence inside royal institutions is rarely measured by titles alone. It is measured through confidence, trust, and the invisible loyalties operating beneath ceremonial appearances. And insiders whisper that, after the controversy surrounding the letters, Camilla's political standing within sections of the monarchy quietly weakened in ways that could never be publicly discussed. At the center of it all stood Charles himself, emotionally exhausted, increasingly isolated, and reportedly burdened by the painful understanding that his reign had become dead, defined by forces he could no longer fully control. Palace observers claim the king desperately wanted peace inside the family, yet the deeper truth confronting him was devastatingly simple. The monarchy had already chosen continuity over comfort. New operational boundaries allegedly took effect quietly across palace structures. Access tightened. Administrative oversight became more rigid. Old protocols returned with renewed force. According to insiders, it was as though the institution itself had instinctively moved to fortify its foundations after sensing instability too close to the throne. And through it all, Queen Elizabeth's letters remained suspended over the monarchy like a ghost no one could escape. They were never officially released, their full contents never publicly confirmed. Yet their impact reportedly reshaped relationships, altered perceptions, and reignited old questions about loyalty, legitimacy, and the future direction of the crown. In death, Elizabeth II had seemingly achieved something extraordinary. She continued governing through silence alone. Perhaps that is the final lesson hidden beneath the entire saga. The monarchy was never designed to protect individual happiness. It was built to survive generations of conflict, ambition, betrayal, and sacrifice. Personal feelings fade. Public narratives shift. But the institution endures only when those inside it are willing to place duty above blood, responsibility above emotion, and continuity above themselves. That was reportedly the principle Queen Elizabeth defended for 70 years. And according to those closest to the unfolding crisis, it may have been the very warning she tried to leave behind in her final private words. Now, as the silence once again settles over Balmoral and the ancient machinery of the crown continues moving forward without pause, the unanswered questions surrounding those letters remain buried deep within the sacred geography of the British monarchy. But one truth appears impossible to ignore. Even after death, Queen Elizabeth II's shadow still stretches across every corridor of royal power. Because in the House of Windsor, power may pass from one sovereign to another, but legacy belongs only to those willing to protect the crown when silence becomes war. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.